horror, and the word safety isn't the first thing that comes to mind. Creepy dolls do, though, and creaking doors. But while a glimpse of Kathy Bates might flip you back over the sofa, stay in your seat and you'll realise that horror can actually be a respite in times of trouble. It sounds like a contradiction, and it is. Known as the paradox of horror, the idea of actively enjoying scary things has been bothering philosophers for centuries. It seems an unaccountable pleasure which the spectators of a well-written tragedy receive from sorrow, terror, anxiety, and other passions that are in themselves disagreeable and uneasy, said 18th century philosopher David Hume. And he hadn't even seen The Haunting of Hill House. So come into the darkness with me now and let's look at the ways that the horror genre can actually be a giant reassuring hug. Author Joe Hill, we'll talk about his famous dad in a bit, has said that every great work of horror fiction is an exercise in extreme empathy. It's about falling in love with characters and then staying with them as they endure the worst. The word to think about here then is endure. Glass half empty types tend to focus on horror's deaths. But if, like me, you sip gin from a half-full cup, you'll instead celebrate the survivalist grit. Yes, peripheral characters suffer and fall, but that emphasises the sheer will of the central characters pushing these stories forward. Look at Maddie in Mike Flanagan's Hush. Deaf and without the power to speak, she falls prey to a masked man stalking the darkness outside her remote home. Channeling the spirits of all the final girls before her though, Maddie survives the night, and cinematic justice is done. Her journey isn't without white-knuckle tension, but she's not a victim, she's a force to be reckoned with. It turns out that happily ever afters aren't just for fairy tales, they're for scary tales too. There are exceptions to the rule. Where would we be without a twist that sets up a sequel? But even with that caveat, horror usually ties up its loose ends in a brightly coloured bow. But why is it that we can actively enjoy watching fictional humans suffering? Well, it's because horror loves rules, and it has two different kinds. The first are the rules imposed by the story itself. The higher concept a story is, the clearer its rules are. Don't look, don't make too much noise, don't sleep, don't do something awful to your fellow humans that will make a deranged serial killer strap you a little too close to a spinning blade. What these rules then allow us to do is mentally put a cross against the characters who don't follow them. It doesn't make it any less scary that we know how the Weeping Angels work.
Don't even blink. Blink and you're dead.
But knowing that characters who disobey the rules will disappear makes it easier to differentiate who to root for. Justice is done. Hannibal only eats the rude, after all.
People don't always tell you what they're thinking. They just see to what you don't advance in life.
Then there are the rules of the genre itself that we learn the more horror we watch. They're the you yell at the screen when you know a character is doing something that we've learned from other horror stories will land them in trouble. Run from clowns. Don't play with Ouija boards. Don't snap pictures of your friends with a clearly haunted camera. There's the going to investigate a strange noise alone trope. Behaving like horror movies don't exist, even in fictional universes, and going somewhere you shouldn't.
It's you again? Seriously? You're following me now?
And let's not forget ignoring your children's super creepy drawings until it's far too late. It's our smug knowledge that we wouldn't do these things that makes horror a comforting escape from our own, less certain reality. It's important to note here though that this is why you'll find some scary genres much more reassuring than others. Attractive teen schlock with its clear formula is very different from horror that knows your expectations and subverts them. The rules, and thus the stabilisers, can be removed.
What's happening? Mom!
Speaking of, it's time to mention a man who actively hacks not just the stabilisers of horror, but the brakes too. And probably the handlebars for good measure. Stephen King is responsible for some of the most terrifying modern horror. The first adaptation of It scarred millennials so badly with coulrophobia that of course Andy Muschietti remade it so that Generation Z wouldn't be left out. The reason that King's stories endure through the decades is because you care about his characters as much as you fear his monsters. Few horror protagonists have as much heart as his heroes. They're worth investing and believing in, because they have real lives, difficult relationships, and dreams. They're humans on the hunt for connection, meaning, and joy. This depth and realism means we see ourselves reflected in his characters. Stephen King stories are stories about us. And most of the time, the people in his fictional towns make it through the horror. To be afraid in a Stephen King story is to accept that the world is a scary place, but together we can get through it, scars and all. A belief that's all the better to take back into the real world. But horror isn't exclusively about suffering to prove a point. If horror is comfort food, the comedy variety is macaroni and cheese sprinkled with little chunks of crispy bacon. To scare and make us giggle at the same time is one of the cleverest plays in the book. The Cabin in the Woods, for instance, plays with those rules we talked about earlier and gives our horror knowledge a little massage before throwing every monster in the book at us with wry humour.
Oh, shit.
And the cleverest comedy horror doesn't need to sacrifice scares for laughter. Troll Hunter sounds ludicrous, but trolls were funny until they ate someone you quite liked. The ancient Greeks invented the tragedy comedy masks because they knew both are strengthened by the other. Emotional punches land harder when our bellies have just been softened by comic relief. And vice versa. It's this balance that provides comfort. Comedy horror will push you, but it'll tickle you while it does.
Too much.
Finally, it's time to talk about horror as a kind of therapy in the modern world. Of all mediums, horror is unafraid to tackle the issues we face on a daily basis. As society changes, so does horror, tackling controversial themes and reflecting our everyday fears and phobias. On the surface, The Platform is a gory high-concept thriller about a gradually lowering table of food. Go deeper though, and it's a fascinating parable about the catastrophic effects of capitalism on modern society. Or look at Baba Kanwari's Under the Shadow, a haunting psychological horror set amidst the War of the Cities during the Iran-Iraq War. While its spirit seems supernatural in nature, there's no hiding from the very real monsters hunting a mother and daughter in 1988 Iran. Horror then gives us a safe space to process our fears. These monsters, built of fiction, are vanquished by the end credits, or, at the very least, grappled with in a safe environment. There's no denying that horror isn't always pleasant, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to switch it off in favour of fluffier viewing. Strength, endurance, humour, characters worth caring about, they're all alive and well in the horror genre. Everything is going to be okay. Honest.